This place, without all question, is the most pleasant and healthful place in all this country, and the most convenient for habitation.
The images evoked by the words of young explorer Henry Fleet captured the beauty of this lush and rocky wilderness that would be known as Montgomery County. Although Fleet first explored this area in the early 1620s, it had been inhabited for centuries.
We know that people were here as early as 10,000 BC. And the reason we know this is because in a number of places in the county, 3 or 4 places perhaps, we have found something called the Clovis Point. A Clovis Point was first identified as a particular type of point in Clovis, New Mexico, but has been associated with a culture that archaeologists have called big game hunting, perhaps. They went perhaps after mastodon or mammoth, something like that. That was perhaps their primary focus, although they did probably make use of all different types of flora and fauna in the area. These people existed here as early as 10,000 BC and continued their lifestyle on down till about 8,000 BC.
The woodlands surrounding Montgomery provided refuge to many nomadic tribes who survived off the natural resources these parklands offered.
These people we call the archaic people. They essentially were a hunting and gathering culture, which means that they had no fixed abode, but went from place to place and took advantage of the seasonality of the environment. So perhaps they would be down shellfishing in the southern Maryland in the summertime, coming up into Montgomery County and establishing their campsites for hunting and nut gathering, perhaps in the fall or spring. They also came up here to make use of quarry. A lot of the points and tools that they used were made out of quartz.
After 1000 AD, the agriculturally rich land along the Potomac began to show signs of growth and settlement.
These villages dot the Potomac, especially around Seneca Creek, where the floodplain is a little larger. They engaged in floodplain agriculture. Who these people were, we're not quite sure. It looks like now that perhaps they were a eastern extension of a western culture, perhaps related to the Monongahela culture of the Ohio Valley.
Taking advantage of the rich soil along the Potomac, early inhabitants were able to cultivate and harvest a nourishing bounty.
Most people would think of these Indians as growing corn, beans, and squash, but the actual truth is that for about 1,000 years, people were growing things like sunflower, another thing like sumpweed, and another one called chenopodium.
Around 1500 AD, inhabitants of this area disappeared, perhaps due to land overuse or warfare. No absolute account is known. Once again a vast uninhabited wilderness, the area along the Potomac soon began to see its first European explorers.
At the time of contact, when John Smith sailed up the Potomac in 1608, Montgomery County was a no man's land. There were actually no prehistoric populations living here. Seneca Creek is called Seneca Creek because the Seneca Indians, who were Iroquoian speaking, used that valley as a trail north and south. And the Piscataway were then established in southern Maryland, up as far west perhaps as the Anacostia River. And they were the outlying villages for the Algonquian-speaking Piscataway.
As early settlers began to make their way to this new frontier, land ownership had to be determined and divided. This task was left to the initial land proprietors of Maryland.
Maryland was owned by the proprietor, the Lords Baltimore. They owned all of the land. It had been granted to them by the King of England. And so when the first land was obtained in what is now Montgomery County, they were called patents. And one received a patent of land by having it surveyed, giving it a name, and then they received the ownership of the property.
These early landowners often identified their tracts with unusual names. For example, the earliest land grant within Montgomery County was given to Henry Darnell. He named it Girl's Portion, and its location was present-day Silver Spring. However, the wealthy and influential men who obtained land grants had no intention of actually living on them or improving them.
It's a complicated system, but to simplify it, it's easier to say that they were wealthy speculators who patented or were given access to these vast tracts of land, and then they often subdivided them, sold them, rented them in the initial years. That was the inducement to get people up and to populate the area in this wilderness. And they would make their money off a system of rents, which would be paid in tobacco. The first settlers just hacked their way out of a wilderness with an axe and a hoe to grub tobacco, and they would pay the rents in the form of tobacco leaves.
Tobacco leaves, cut, cured, and packed in barrels, eventually made their way to market for inspection and sale. By the early 1750s, Montgomery County already had a vital link to the rest of the world, the Georgetown seaport.
When the county was created, Georgetown was already a thriving port, a busy little town, and by far the largest center of population in Montgomery County. So when Washington, D.C. was created, Georgetown was lost to the county. But it had been for 50 years or so a very busy tobacco port, and this old road out here that we call Rockville Pike and Old Georgetown Road had been one of the routes for getting tobacco down to Georgetown.
As the cash crop of the 18th century, tobacco was used as the primary medium of exchange. Used for everything from buying land and paying rents to paying court fines. And although this means of compensation was important to land tenants, especially for building a home or farm, growing a sizable tobacco crop was challenging.
The cultivation of tobacco was a very labor-intensive kind of thing, and it was very hard for a farmer to eke out a living. So there were very few large homes built in the county until after about 1750.
By the end of the 18th century, Montgomery County experienced a period of agricultural depression. As the soil gave out, tobacco farming was no longer lucrative. Seeking a better future, farmers migrated west to fresh land, where tobacco farming would again be profitable. Unlike southern Maryland's location on the coastal plain, Montgomery County lies above the fall line. Settlers had to contend with hilly landscapes dominated by woods and rocky stream valleys. It's no surprise that these conditions gave rise to a milling economy relatively early.
Montgomery County, central Maryland, western Maryland in particular, the lands above the fall line were particularly well suited for the adaptation of water power because of the fall power, as it was called, on the bubbling streams, the rocky streams, from Paint Branch on the eastern side of the county all the way out to Watts Branch on the western side of the county. And so they gave rise to a small-scale rural industry, everything from tan yards to sumac mills to sawmills and grist mills to grind grain.
There were a lot of mills in Montgomery County, and they weren't just grist mills, that is, they didn't just process grain. There were lumber mills, there were textile mills, there were mills that produced fertilizer and other products of that kind. And almost every creek and river around had a mill, at least one on it, and some of them had a half a dozen.
Today, only 2 mills remain standing in Montgomery County, Black Rock Mill and the Hyattstown Mill. In 1748, Frederick County was formed from the western boundary of Prince George's County and included present-day Montgomery County. Slowly, a foundation began to evolve. But within a few years, settlers were touched by the French and Indian Wars. In April of 1755, General Edward Braddock led British colonial troops through the county en route to Fort Cumberland. Troops camped in Rockville and proceeded to Dowden's Ordinary, a tavern that stood in present-day Clarksburg. Volunteers and conscripts were added along the way. Food, supplies, and wagons were requisitioned from local farmers, and citizens were threatened by border raids. When the Treaty of Paris ended the French and Indian Wars in 1763, citizens enjoyed a respite from conflict. But before long, new tensions developed. The issue of slavery posed both a moral and economic question that divided many citizens in the county. Because of the decline in tobacco farming, Montgomery County never had large plantations with hundreds of slaves. Yet, ironically, the county was the setting for one of the most famous anti-slavery books of all time, Uncle Tom's Cabin. The memoirs of Josiah Henson, a runaway slave who once lived in a cabin not far from Old Georgetown Road, form the basis of Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel. Josiah Henson's own writings give a glimpse of the everyday life of a slave.
We lodged in log huts and on the bare ground. Wooden floors were an unknown luxury. In a single room were huddled like cattle, 10 or a dozen persons, men, women, and children. Our beds were collections of straw and old rags, thrown down in corners and boxed in with boards. The wind whistled and the rain and snow blew in through the cracks, and the damp earth soaked in the moisture till the floor was miry as a pigsty.
Both of my sets of grandparents were slaves. My father's family was in Richmond, Virginia, and my mother's family was right here in Montgomery County. My grandfather was sold over in the Seneca area to a family named Joseph White. My grandmother was a slave in the Poolesville area, all of her sisters and brothers.
Slavery, states' rights, and secession from the Union divided the United States, and so too divided the citizens of Montgomery County.
In the years leading up to the war, Montgomery County, like a lot of Maryland, were Southern Democrats, or particularly just Democrats at that particular time. Maryland and Montgomery County being a slave-owning state and county, there were roughly 770, I believe, slave owners in Montgomery County, majority of them holding a few slaves, but they were more socially as well as economically tied to Virginia.
There were more than 100 young men who crossed the Potomac and fought for the Confederacy, volunteers, mostly cavalrymen. But there are also more than 100 young men who joined Mr. Lincoln's army voluntarily, mostly infantrymen. So the county is pretty equally divided, and there is a class distinction that's made there between the people who supported their country and fought in blue uniforms and those who fought for the lost cause of the Confederacy.
As the Civil War gained steam, Montgomery County never found itself as a major theater of war, but its location was strategic.
As the war moved south or moved north, at times there were many Union troops in Montgomery County, and other times very few. There were, however, in each of the war years, some major movements of Union troops and Confederate troops through Montgomery County. The first occasion was in October of 1861 for the Battle of Ball's Bluff over near Leesburg, Virginia. The battle took place on Virginia soil, but all of the Union troops involved had been stationed up around Poolesville. This was a disaster for the Union forces, in which they were pushed back into the river and many of the Union troops drowned.
Throughout the war years, there were other troop movements throughout Montgomery County. The Antietam Campaign, Jubal Early's Confederate raid on Washington, and Jeb Stuart on his way to Gettysburg. Under orders to protect Washington and Baltimore, General McClellan's Union Army spread itself throughout Montgomery County.
One wing went out River Road before crossing, moving up toward Frederick. The second wing, the middle wing, came right up Route 355 through Gettysburg and so forth to Frederick. And the third wing, the right wing, moved up the Brookville Pike through Brookville and up to the Newmarket area before converging on Frederick.
As the war was nearing an end, the question of slavery was still unresolved for the state of Maryland. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, issued in January 1864, only applied to states that had seceded from the Union. Since Maryland never seceded, it maintained its slave status.
It wasn't until 1864 where a new constitutional convention took place in Maryland, where slavery within the state was abolished.
The first thing a black family wanted was a piece of land. That was their heart's desire, to have a piece of land. So they got their land usually from their former masters. It was a part of the land that the master couldn't farm. It was down in the woods, or it was marshy or stony or something. It was part of land that he didn't want. But those black people took that marshy, stony, woodsy land and made communities out of them.
The end of the war and the emancipation of slaves brought many changes, but the idea of a united country was far from a reality.
In the post-war period, in regard to the continuing pro-South or pro-Northern feelings about the citizens of Montgomery County, my conclusion is that it remained pro-South.
When the war was ended and peace was restored and the slaves were free, the government still was in the control of the people who had supported the Confederacy. And they continued to run Montgomery County right down till pretty recently, in fact.
The degree of local support for the Confederacy found expression in the erection of a prominent monument in Rockville.
It's a statue of a Confederate cavalryman, because the people who were running the county after the Civil War were the same people who were running the county before the Civil War. There's no statue to the men who fought for their country, only one to the guys who fought against it.
Well, the Metropolitan BRR is at last completed, and the regular passenger trains have commenced running. Many assembled at the depot to witness the Iron Horse as he went dashing by. The great work has been accomplished, and our people may bid farewell to slow coaches and muddy roads. They can now go to Washington in 45 minutes at a cost of 60 cents. This is much gained in time and money to the traveling public, while the farmer along the line, its advantages are incalculable. 5 and 6 trains have been running daily, and after Monday next, 12 trains a day will pass over the roads.
The long-awaited B&O Railroad finally came through Montgomery County in 1873 and started service in 1874. Its early route originated in Washington and came through the county to Point of Rocks in Frederick County, where it joined the B&O main line. E. Brooke Lee formed a strong political base in the county. In many respects, he created the governmental superstructure that supports today's Montgomery County. For over 20 years, Lee used his political power and skill to develop the police force, public schools, zoning regulations, tax system, and transportation network. But during the 1940s, Lee's influence waned.
The charter people, newcomers for the most part, people from other parts of the country, Reform Democrats, the anti-charter people called them goo-goos, good government people. Republicans, there weren't many of those around, organized a drive to give the county self-government rather than have our laws made in Annapolis. And in the elections of 42, 44, 46, and 48, they fought E. Brooke Lee tooth and nail and finally beat him.
This controversial political issue was finally resolved in November of 1948, when citizens voted in favor of a charter form of government. No longer was the county being governed by Annapolis and elected commissioners. This has been the model ever since, with the addition of an elected county executive beginning in 1970. Montgomery's population doubled between 1946 and 1950 and doubled again in the next decade. A building boom created whole new neighborhoods dotting the landscape. Additional schools were built and expanded to accommodate the influx of the new residents. Shopping centers and branches of local department stores began to spring up. With its relatively high family income and educational level, Montgomery County was gaining recognition as one of the region's most affluent areas. The county's population changed not only in size, but in its racial and ethnic composition as well. By the last quarter of the century, half of the county's growth was spread across a variety of minority groups, making Montgomery County one of the most diverse regions in the country.
As far as I know, there's very few counties that can really match the level of diversity here. If you look at the African American population, it's approximately 15%, and the Asian American and the Latinos in Montgomery County are pretty comparable in a little over 11%, the general population. And the school system reflects that even more significantly, in that I think for the first time Montgomery County has reached a level within the school system of the majority white becoming a minority. And the white population now in Montgomery County Public Schools is 49%. I never thought I'd live to see that, so it's actually quite phenomenal.
With residents from all corners of the globe, Montgomery County had become a mix of cultures.
We have immigrants from Russia, Ethiopia, Africa, from any country. Maryland has opened its doors, and when Maryland opened its doors, Montgomery County seems to be the one taking in a lot of the immigrants.
At the same time that the population was growing and changing, the characteristics of Montgomery County's work environment also changed.
Well, after World War II, around the early 50s, late 40s, Montgomery County probably could be best characterized as having a bedroom community serving the center city of Washington, D.C., and this was true nationwide with a lot of major jurisdictions. We developed along radial corridors coming out from the city. I don't think anybody that was around then would recognize Montgomery County. The county has changed in extraordinary ways over the last 25 years.
Commuting became a fact of life in the 50s with the emergence of the two-car family. More vehicles were on the county's roads. The construction of I-270, originally 70 South, and the 1964 opening of the Circumferential Highway, better known as the Beltway, changed the traffic patterns of the county. In 1968, construction was approved for the Metro Rail, with 12 stations located in Montgomery County. Silver Spring and Tacoma Park were the first open in 1978. Metro's Red Line had a great impact on development, stimulating residential and commercial growth in Friendship Heights, Bethesda, Rockville, and Silver Spring. From pre-revolutionary times until World War II, most county land was farmland, and agriculture was the mainstay of the local economy. But in the years following the Second World War, the farming industry experienced a number of transformations. Nowhere was this more evident than on the Allnut family farm.
My dad used to raise beef cattle, and we would, man, that was something. We raised beef cattle and hogs.
It's evolved from livestock to growing vegetables for a cannery, and from the cannery to the wholesale, and from the wholesale to the retail. So we're pretty much a retail operation now.
The demands of World War II drained available labor. Depending on the size of the farm, most farmers relied on new agricultural advances to harvest and maintain crops.
Couldn't find anybody to work because, war effort. So therefore, they invented, how big combines, big tractors, big everything was bigger.
But bigger doesn't always mean better. The economics of farming and expenditures for farm equipment often have been the determining factors in the kinds of crops harvested.
Well, the business of farming in Montgomery County is pretty much like any business. It has to be profitable to go on. And like businesses in general, capital is needed. You have to buy a combine, $100,000. You have to put all your inputs in up front before you start receiving any of the income. So you have a period of 4 months that all your money's sitting in the ground at risk, and finally in 4 months you get your money. That may be one reason that we got into a relatively less capital intensive business here with a retail operation.
Like farmers, there were others who did not reap the benefits of the county's growth and affluence.
As the suburban development moved out from the district, it rode over the existing housing and farming areas, which were the background of Montgomery County. And they simply moved the poor people out. And I always tell people that the White Oak Shopping Center was built on the site of one of the larger black communities of low-income people. The city of Rockville was the first in the county to deal with the crying needs of low-income people, and they have the first public housing built in Montgomery County. The Housing Authority of Montgomery County built their first public housing in Tobytown in Potomac. It was a very seriously substandard community, and new housing was built, and it has continued all these years to provide decent housing for the old residents of this historic black community of Montgomery County.
For the most part, public housing programs were successful, but they weren't a complete answer to the housing problems of the county. While public housing met the needs of Montgomery's low-income population, there were others whose needs were not being addressed.
Somebody had to do something about the fact that inflation, which developed in the 70s, pushed market rate housing out of the reach of ordinary people, teachers and policemen and just ordinary people who would like to live close to where they work.
Housing advocates and county lawmakers did pass legislation in 1978 that required developers of 50 or more homes to include at best 15% of the units at a moderate price. Montgomery was the first county in the United States to enact such legislation, which became a model for the nation. The growing economic influence of Montgomery County had a widespread effect on shopping patterns. More convenient shopping malls with branches of major department stores traditionally found in downtown D.C. began to spring up around the county. The county's growth boom, though great for the economy, spurred controversy. Phenomenal population growth, accompanied by thousands of acres rezoned for residential and high-density use, created a new reality in Montgomery County. Pro-growth, slow-growth, and anti-growth advocates began to voice their concerns as early as the 1950s, and the best way to manage growth and development continues to be a hot political issue. At the beginning of the 21st century, with a population approaching 1 million, Montgomery County is a study in contrasts. Who calls it home? Its citizens run the gamut, from people whose families have lived here for generations and people who have recently arrived.
If you just walk down New Hampshire Avenue, you can see the diversity by just looking at the places of worship. It is amazing. And this is where, I mean, if you want to take a picture of what diversity looks like in Montgomery County, just take a picture of those temples and synagogues and churches that are lined up so close to each other, you know, respecting each other's rights to worship in whatever way they wish. I mean, to me, that's what it's all about, you know, freedom to worship and coexist.
Montgomery County, partly rural, partly suburban, and partly urban. Its landscape has rolling acres and natural woodlands, high-rises and high-tech complexes, small town life, and the amenities of the city. Montgomery County, rich in history and poised to meet the future.